This has always been a place where resources have been gathered and then taken somewhere else. So a lot of times that resource is the hot water that sort of rejuvenates cultures. People have taken the quartz crystals from the area, the novaculite rocks from the area. Since the early 1800s, Hot Springs has sort of been on the trajectory to be what it is today, which is one of, if not the oldest unit in the National Park Service. In 1804, there are efforts to explore scientifically the Louisiana Purchase by the United States federal government. And what's confirmed here is that the water comes out at 143 degrees on average. So it was this hydrogeological wonder. And it was also, in those early records, a place where people were going for health. It's set aside as Hot Springs Reservation to protect the water from private ownership so that the people of the United States could use the water. And that sort of rural, off to the side understanding of hot springs persisted until after the Civil War. And what happens is that there is a rising middle class, a rising urbanization in the United States, but there's also the rise of railroads, and railroad owners would promote specific destinations. Hot Springs developed as one of the leading medical resorts in the United States, beginning really in the 1870s, and then by 1900, it is sort of the flagship mineral spring destination in the country. And so Hot Springs is part of this transcontinental medical movement. By 1900, we have traveled from 1804 with people just being like, yeah, the water's hot, to being one of the most famous mineral spring resorts in the world. With the rise of the National Park Service in the early 1900s, there is renewed attention to like the medicinal aspects of the water, or trying to make it a medicinal resort. And so Hot Springs is the most visited national park in the country at the founding of the National Park Service. It's also has the accommodations that people want. You can access it by train or car. You stay for 3 weeks at a time. There's entertainment here. And so Hot Springs is sort of considered the great American spa by the early 19-teens because of its connection with the federal government. There's also the Army-Navy hospital. There's also a government-free bathhouse. So if people are trying to understand the growth of the American federal government, they can look to Hot Springs and say, hey, there's a place where the government has owned this water for almost 100 years. And they do such a good job that they can make money on the bathhouses that are privately owned. And they can provide the water to the people, whether they can afford to pay for it or whether they can't. And it's like this tremendous accomplishment, or at least it's seen by the people.
I would argue that parks today could be used for public health and like health promotion across the board. So having access to nature and natural spaces is so good for our health, mental health, physical health, emotional health. And so that's kind of what we see, or we should see parks as today. But this park, Hot Springs, was established on the basis of public health and promoting public health. People came here when they had nowhere else to turn and sought healing from the thermal water. And that is super unique for a national park to have that kind of history. Because today we're becoming more invested in holistic health. Like back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, like who the heck was talking about holistic health? They probably weren't even using that phrase. But when folks came here, that is the experience that they were getting, right? So you came here for a specific reason and you would bathe, you came here to bathe, but also it expanded, right? They built this entire park around the thermal springs, and a lot of that was for other health promoting activities. I always point to hiking, so you weren't just here for one type of health promotion. It turned into like so much more than that. Like imagine if we thought of going to parks as like preventative health care, which it can be, right? But nobody's gonna think about it like that, even though it's objectively like good and healthy. And very few people like view health as prevention based. It's a lot of like, well, you're sick, so then you go to a doctor. This park can give us so much as a way of health promotion, whether it's taking a hike on a trail that's helping your physical health, or you're driving around the mountain and that you're like looking at these beautiful views and that kind of like it's good for your mental health or emotional health or spiritual health. People find parks to be very spiritual places, particularly like tucked in nature.
It's a complicated process, as you might imagine, but contrary to popular belief, we do not have a volcano under Hot Springs. What's happening here is that rain fell about 4,000 to 4,400 years ago in our recharge area. So this is a place of very permeable rock, which is primarily novaculite and chert. So that permeable rock kind of absorbs the water like a sponge and lets it run all the way down until it hits a impermeable layer called shale. Now that shale is basically just really compressed mud, and there's no way for the water to get through it because all the little cracks and crevices have just been closed shut. Now that layer is deep enough that you're actually kind of getting close to the mantle here. So the temperature increase in the water is basically just that thermocline that happens as you go deeper through the soil. So the weight of all of that water on top of it now is pushing down all the way to that impermeable layer, right? So within that area, we have these things called faults, which are basically just these large cracks that go all the way from the surface down to that layer of impermeable shale. So the water that was rain 4,000 years ago is now pushed up to the surface through those cracks by the weight of the water falling today. So you have this like pressure system pushing the water out, which is what we call artesian pressure, up through these faults and out through the springs.
So we have four affiliated tribes: the Absentee Pawnee, the Osage, the Quapaw, and the Caddo. We know that the ancestors of the Caddo have been coming here for thousands of years, and we know that because there are quarries of novaculite in the area. So people are coming to the Hot Springs region, they're collecting the stone, and then they're taking it elsewhere. And we find this in some of the oldest mound sites in the United States. Poverty Point, it's about 4,000 years old, and it has Arkansas novaculite on the site. the caddo, as they're sort of recognized today, have been in this region for about 1,000 years. We have oral histories from the Quapaw that this was like a wintering, that you might stop at these springs as like a sort of a ritualistic bathing. And so the Quapaw have been in southeast Arkansas for about 400 years. And then prior to Indian removal, this area is claimed by the Quapaw. And so the Quapaw sign a treaty that relinquishes the land. And so that's when it turns over to specifically federal hands in 1818. But then you see several groups that are on the Trail of Tears specifically stop at hot springs. And so we know that now there's like this knowledge across the southeast, and for people who are living in what's now Oklahoma, they know hot springs exists. They're traveling here. Our archaeologists recently found letters in our archive of requests for Osage, Chickasaw, for people in the early 1900s to be given free passes to the springs. And so like that idea that Native Americans have disappeared, not true. So even still today and throughout the 20th century, that story has not gone away. It is still here.
So invasive species are a huge problem in our native ecosystems today. Invasive species are bad because they're basically drowning out the native habitat. You know, native plants, native animals are getting displaced by these invasives. So what we have to do is we have to control them ourselves. So we go around by just ripping them out of the ground, or sometimes using a little bit of herbicide for the particularly hardy invasives that are resistant to mechanical removal. And we do that all over the park, hoping to restore and maintain a more natural ecosystem. One of the other dangers of these invasives is they can often be poisonous to our local wildlife. And remember, our local wildlife hasn't evolved alongside these plants before, so they don't know which berries are poisonous versus harmless on these invasives, right? So a good example of this is Nandina. The birds will eat these berries that the Nandina produce, and thinking that it's a good meal, but they get sick and sometimes die. So it's up to us to remove those invasives before that can happen.